everybody hear me?
Very well.
Okay. First of all, I want to know if the name Herodotus is familiar to you all.
Oh, actually,
He was an ancient Greek who is known as the father of history. And this gifted and talented man would have appreciated our speaker today, Michael S. Malone. Mike Malone is one of the world's best known technology writers and has covered Silicon Valley and high tech for more than 40 years. He began his career at the San Jose Mercury News, where his investigative journalism led to 2 Pulitzer Prize nominations.
wow.
Since then, his articles and editorials have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and Fortune. Mike was a columnist for the New York Times and editor of Forbes ASAP, the world's largest circulation business tech magazine at the height of the dot-com boom. As you've read in today's invitation, Mike is the author or co-author of nearly 30 award-winning books. And his very first book, titled The Big Score, The Billion-Dollar Story of Silicon Valley, has just been reprinted in a new edition and has become a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And it only took 36 years. Go, Mike. Mike has hosted 3 nationally syndicated public television interview series and co-produced The New Heroes, the Emmy-nominated primetime PBS miniseries on social entrepreneurs. Currently, he and NBC Bay Area newsman Scott Budman host an acclaimed weekly podcast called Silicon Valley Insider, and that is a must for everybody, Silicon Valley Insider. Mike holds an MBA from Santa Clara, where he's currently an adjunct professor. He's an associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University and distinguished friend of Oxford. Are you impressed yet? Are you impressed?
Yes, I'm intimidated enough that I'm not going to ask a question.
As well as being a wonderful writer, editor, professor, entrepreneur, media personality, husband, and father, he's also a distinguished Eagle Scout. He's been a mentor to more than 100 scouts who've received an Eagle distinction.
Wow.
Mike serves as president of the Silicon Valley chapter of the National Eagle Scouts Association and is the assistant scoutmaster of Troop 466 in Sunnyvale. Mike is not a newcomer to ARCS. He graciously moderated a talk with 2 Nobel laureates at our 2014 Scholar Awards lunch and authored an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal calling for more support for graduate students in STEM and highlighting the work of the ARCS Foundation, for which, Michael, we will be forever grateful. Mike's going to talk to us tonight about Silicon Valley, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and what's to come. And it is my great pleasure and Steve Millard's great pleasure to introduce our friend, Mike Malone.
Yay.
Wow. Thank you, Linda. I think that's the only time Troop 466 and Herodotus have ever been included in the same introduction.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to warn you all, I may be the only person who has a house older in Silicon Valley than Mike Fox does. And as he can tell you, thick walls don't always make for clear internet connections. So I just got an unstable message and it went away. So hopefully we have an hour of clarity here, but raise your hand if you suddenly can't hear me. And thank you, Linda. The truth is, I do these things because I just can't say no to Linda. That's the bottom line.
We all
Yeah.
suffer.
Nobody can.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not nobility of spirit on my part. It's Linda talking me into these things. So thank you, Linda. And hi, folks. It's good to see you again. It's been a while since I've done an ARCS event. And I've done it in front of large crowds. I've done it I've been a judge on a competition of yours. It's the first time I've ever done it on the internet. So we'll try to make this Zoom, I'll try to make it as personal and as comfortable as possible. Linda mentioned my first book. This is the reissue. That's all beautiful copper. I love this book. It's beautiful. And it's so sturdy. You could put it underneath the back wheel of a car stuck in the snow and it wouldn't damage the book. The original edition, it's called a classic now, but when it came out, it was it was from Doubleday. They were running out of money. They put it on paper that was basically toilet paper and bound it so that it would break apart after about a year. So to have this thing, have this thing 40 years later come back is sort of vindication for all the misery I went through. When I finished this book the first time, I had $10 in the world. So, and within 6 months, I got to see it on the remainder shelf at the local bookstore. So 40 years later, to have it reach at Amazon #1 is very satisfying. So anyway, today, what I want to do is, I mean, you all, some of you have been in Silicon Valley for longer than me. You know, I got here as a kid in 1963, but some of you have been here for only a short time. Some of you have been deeply involved, like Mike, let's say, has been heavily involved right in the middle of Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. And some of you have moved on from the Valley and you mostly read about it in the newspaper or watch it on the news. So what I propose to do today in 45 minutes is to do 3 parts, 15 minutes each. Silicon Valley past, how this place got going, how we got to where we are. Silicon Valley today, in this sort of weird interregnum we're in because of COVID. And then Silicon Valley future. What are the likely scenarios for how Silicon Valley moves into the future and our fate? So let's start with Valley past. Okay, when we think of Silicon Valley, we tend to think of ever since Apple Computer. But in fact, the distance the Valley exists, I mean, the Valley's always been here, but it was Santa Clara Valley, then the Valley of Heart's Delight, which was a marketing campaign for all the fruit growers in the 20s and 30s. But the Valley existed longer before Steve Jobs than it has afterwards in terms of business and technology. You can date the Valley back to 1900, Silicon Valley back to 1900, with Cy Elwell and Lee DeForest, who were designing the very first vacuum tubes. Lee DeForest invented essentially the tube, which gave us radio and telegraphy, modern telegraphy, and all of that, and led to generation after generation. The tube turned into the transistor turned into the integrated circuit in 1969, the miracle year, turned into the microprocessor, and that gave us the world we have today. So if you were to come here, this is the oldest house in Silicon Valley, oldest American house, the one I'm in right now, built officially during the Civil War, most likely in the early 1850s. If you had been here at the time this house was built, I have some photographs in the 1890s, you would have seen essentially grassland as far as you could see, from mountain to bay, with a few gigantic oak trees that were 300-400 years old. It's a very peaceful life. The other identifiable feature doesn't exist now. These were Indian mounds. The Costanoan Indians would build giant mounds the size of modern football fields and up to 50 feet tall, and fill them with rubbish, old tools, and the bodies of their dead. And apparently the first Western arrivals into the Bay Area could see these mounds from the far side of the bay. I mean, it was apparently a pretty spectacular sight. It was such a gracious lifestyle. It's estimated that the Indians worked 2 days a week on fishing or gathering acorns, and spent the rest of the time basically producing new Indians. So it was a very gracious lifestyle. When we think, oh, you know, it's so much better now in the Valley than it was 200 years ago. Well, think again. Then the Jesuits arrived, actually the Franciscans and the Jesuits, and they set up Santa Clara mission. The Indians flocked together and actually became a tribe for the first time. They'd always been family units killing each other. And the modern Valley begins, the Valley of Heart's Delight. Now, if you've been here in the 1930s, you would have seen a valley with 1 billion fruit trees. Now, it was apparently an extraordinary sight that in the springtime, when it all went to flower, all went to blossom, the entire valley turned into one gigantic garden of flowers. And there's one story that It sounds apocryphal, but I researched it years ago, and it's apparently true that one year, and we let me go on. I don't know how I got muted, but let me go back. Mid 1930s, 1 billion fruit trees. Here we go. Let's try that. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up. Okay. So billion fruit trees, that was the business of the valley. Canneries, as you probably all know your history on that, but I bet you haven't heard this story. There was a trolley car that ran from downtown San Jose to Cupertino. It actually ran from a bar just outside downtown San Jose to the whorehouse up in Cupertino, kind of where Monte Vista High School is. And most of the people in the valley traveled that. Well, one spring they had one of these rare years where all the trees went into blossom. And then a few days later, it started raining with high winds, and it blew all the blossoms off the fruit trees. Well, if you add up the number of blossoms, it must have been in the quadrillions of petals. Well, they blew all over the South Bay to the point that they created a blossom whiteout. So you can imagine driving your car, you can't see, everything's white, and it smells like flowers. Well, the people on the trolley car, they got on it, they could barely move because the wheels were spinning on the crushed blossoms in front of them. They finally had to get somebody out with a lantern, this was midday, to lead them up Stevens Creek Road. And when they got to, not far from Mike's house, kind of where the bordello was, they hit the early hills of Cupertino, and all the passengers had to get out, slipping in ankle deep flower blossoms, liquid, and push the trolley car up the track to get to Monte Vista. So that's the Valley of Heart's Delight, the valley it was. Now everything changes right after World War II. It actually changed during World War II because all the young men heading out to the Pacific came through either Long Beach or San Francisco. If they came through San Francisco, they went out and hit the town for a couple of days before they shipped out. They figured that they might not get back, so they might as well have as much fun as they could. And they usually had a great time. And as they left, they looked back on the bay and they said, as they crossed under the Golden Gate, they said, if I survive this thing, I'm coming back here. I'm not going to Iowa. I'm not going to Indiana. I'm not going to Pennsylvania. I'm going to go to California. I'm going to go to the Bay Area and see what I can make of myself. War ends. All these young GIs, they're getting married. They've got their GI Bill, and a sizable number of them head to California. Now, initially, a lot of them headed to Southern California because they wanted to be in the airplane industry. In Burbank, the Lockheed brothers and the rest of them down there. Well, the Lockheed brothers came from Los Gatos. They did their first seaplane tests on the bay. They wanted to get into missiles because they knew that was the future. So they came home to Los Gatos, started Lockheed. Meanwhile, at Stanford, you have this professor that grew up on campus. He had started the first electronics lab in the 30s, a guy named Fred Terman. I got to see his last visit to HP when I was 20. Fred Terman set up an electronics lab and he invited the best and the brightest from the West Coast. And they all showed up to his class, and that included Bill Hewlett, the son of the head of the medical school at Stanford who had died, David Packard, an athlete, the Varian brothers, and a bunch of other truly brilliant individuals. When they finished school, they didn't want to leave. They wanted to hang around Fred Terman, so he helped them find places to live and jobs. And so you begin to have this small enclave of technology people in the midst of this agricultural region. As you know the story, Hewlett Packard worked out of Packard's house on Addison Way in Palo Alto. Bill Hewlett lived in the garage, and they started Hewlett Packard. it pretty much stayed that way. Lockheed and a few surrounding companies, HP and a few supportive companies in Palo Alto. Lockheed was in Sunnyvale, until the late 50s. And at that point, you have another figure, Bill Shockley, who just won the Nobel Prize or was about to win the Nobel Prize. And he was not a real popular guy. He was a very difficult human being. Many of you probably met him at some point. Shockley wanted to come home to Palo Alto where he grew up. And he wanted to take the new transistor, which he had helped create, got the Nobel Prize for. And he started a company called Fairchild. It was originally Shockley Transistor. Well, and he brought the best and the brightest once again from all over the country. Noyce, Moore, Herney, really the legendary figures of Silicon Valley. And they worked for him for a few months and realized they had made a terrible mistake, that he was literally the worst boss in history. I mean, when you're a genius level scientist and you're coming up with extraordinary creations and your boss makes you take lie detector tests weekly to make sure that you actually did it, you kind of get insulted. So one morning, all 8 of them got up and left. They just met on a driveway and picked everybody up, drove by Bob Noyce's house because he was a crucial guy and they didn't know if he was coming out. He came out and they started Fairchild. And Fairchild got their money from Fairchild Camera and Instrument. Many of you have connections to the venture capital industry. That was the birth of the venture capital industry as they went looking for money. They even went to shoe companies. They went to everybody trying to find money. And Fairchild Camera and Instrument back east gave them the money. Well, Fairchild was the most interesting company in Valley history. I mean, you could say Apple, you could say Facebook, but there was simply nothing like Fairchild. Everybody there was under 30 years old. They were brilliant. They were changing the world. And it was an absolute madhouse. It was essentially a frat house dropped into the middle of Mountain View. And it couldn't last forever. But while it existed, they invented the integrated circuit, the invention of the modern world. And then it blew up. People were fighting in hallways. People were getting recruited elsewhere. And they fanned out the fair children and created modern Silicon Valley. So roll forward another 20 years, pretty quiet period, big systems companies and that sort of thing like Tandem and Rome. And then you get to the 1980s, well, officially 1976. And Mike knows more about this than me because that's the birth of Apple. Now, I knew those guys. I knew Jobs in elementary school and Woz in junior high. They were neighbors. They did not look like anything you'd ever seen in Silicon Valley starting a company before. I actually thought I saw them buy the parts for the Apple I, and I thought they were buying marijuana equipment. They were buying roach clips. And I thought, well, it fits. They looked that way. And I didn't realize they were going to turn the world upside down. And that gets us to the explosion of consumer products in the Valley. So the Valley's gone through eras. And in 1984, really with the introduction of the Macintosh, the world changes again. I'm trying to get you up to the present as fast as possible, but essentially the Valley begins in Palo Alto. It moves to Sunnyvale, Mountain View in Palo Alto, and it stays there for a number of years. Then it starts heading down towards Santa Clara, the epicenter, when the system houses got going. And then Cupertino with Apple, and then with the rise of all the software companies responding to the personal computer from Apple and IBM, it begins to move up the peninsula. And then the next big moment is really the 1990s, when the internet becomes ascendant and thousands of companies get created around here, all designing software for access to the internet or being able to move around the internet like Netscape, be able to search for things on the internet like Google. And the mid-peninsula becomes the epicenter of the Valley. After that, we get the dot-com bubble because we have hundreds of thousands of companies being created for the internet. and they all have to be created by code writers. This is when the great influx of code writers comes to the valley. And the epicenter of the valley, they don't want to live in, boring old, formerly agricultural Silicon Valley. They want to live in the cool city. So the epicenter of the dot-com boom moves to San Francisco, where it has remained for up until maybe 2 years ago. The heart of Silicon Valley has been in the city, to the point that all these young code writers, Silicon Valley is electrical engineers, married families, houses with mortgages on them. Code writers, social networking people are urban, young, not married, no kids, live in an overpriced apartment. So you have these two worlds, and the twain doesn't quite meet. So the valley's been kind of bifurcated for the last 20 years. And the world really knows more about the San Francisco side than the South Bay side. Nobody talks about Intel, much anymore. But a food chain has been developed over the last 50 years with chips at the top. Everything depends upon the chips going down, hardware, software, applications. And that's the world we live in now. And at Apple, we had Steve Jobs driving innovation. He created, not since Hewlett-Packard had we seen a company that was that innovative, that large. And in the course of 20 to 2010, he created 3 gigantic markets, which consume our lives, right? I mean, the music side, the phone side, and the store side. These are multi-billion-dollar markets, all created essentially under the rule of one guy in 10 years. Meanwhile, the dot-com world blew up in 2000, as we all know. And nobody noticed the rise of these new entities called social networks. It wasn't until about 2007 that people looked around and said, wait a minute, there's Facebook, and there's Twitter. What the hell is this? Because the world had all left the valley. The media had left the valley when they figured that the story was over in 2001. So that kind of brings us up to the present. Right now, San Francisco is still kind of ascendant, but it's heading for a decline in terms of its relation to the tech world, because most of the departures out of the valley, or out of the Silicon Valley, if we include San Francisco, have been from San Francisco. The young people are leaving. The city is kind of I don't have to tell you people, it's a mess. It's not the paradise it seemed in 1995. It's suffering from a lot of social ills. Opportunities have disappeared for code writing, and you can write code writing anywhere. And then COVID hit. The valley's also grown from being a place, I got here in 63, and I lived basically in a sea of fruit trees. Over the years, as I've watched, all the orchards have gone down. Housing went up. That was characterized the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But now the valley is growing vertically, and it's growing upwards and upwards, especially in downtown San Jose. I mean, it already has skyscrapers, but when you go to Los Altos, a little tiny former artist town, village, and you start seeing 5-6-story buildings lining Foothill Expressway, and you go down El Camino in Sunnyvale, and you're in a canyon of buildings, you realize that the valley is becoming very urban. And there's only, we're on a alluvial plain down here, and there's not that much room between the bay and the hills. And we kind of don't want people overbuilding the hills. So you're in this tight space. And the valley, and we're in the present now, the valley has chosen, the individuals who live here, all the various cities have chosen to grow upwards instead of letting growth go somewhere else. And the companies here have decided that this milieu, this environment where everybody's thinking about tech, you go to the movie theater and all the ads between movies are for technology companies. There's nothing like that anywhere else in the world. You go to Pete's or you go to Starbucks and you're looking around the little tables and there'll be 6 people jammed around 1 or 2, and they're looking at their laptop, and you realize that's a startup. Those people are looking at their business plan. I can't think of any place else on the planet like this. And so as a result, the companies have decided, the valley's getting crowded. I mean, traffic's been a problem for 20 years. Housing prices are insane. I live across this, I live in a very old house, but I live across the street. I'm in the middle of a housing development from the 1950s. Some of the people still live here. They bought their houses for $17,000. A neighbor just sold theirs the other day, has a pool, a nice lot. He sold it for $3 million. Now, we're not surprised by those numbers. I mean, everywhere else in America, they are aghast when they hear that. I have friends who are real estate agents that say, we get people from the East Coast and they go, well, we live in a Georgian manor house on 30 acres with a pond, and we've sold it and we'd like to get something, comparable here. And they go, well, the real estate guy goes, well, how much did you sell your place for? They go, $750,000. It's burning a hole in our pocket. We want to get something really nice here, maybe Saratoga. And he says the worst part of his job, besides the people crying who lost their bid. I mean, we have houses around here right now where 24 people will stand on the front lawn bidding for a house. And the losers all end up, the wives are crying, the husbands are, feeling like failures. Real estate guys, that's their 2 worst moments: disappointing all those people and then dealing with people who have unreal expectations for what they can live in Silicon Valley. Huge problem. It's not going to get solved easily because companies are going up. I mean, Apple Computer, I'm looking at Mike here in my little picture. Apple Computer could have moved to Tracy. They can put a high-speed trail line in there. You can buy housing cheap. It's got vast acreage of unused land. It's just over the hill at the pass at Altamont. And yet, where did Apple go? Right in the middle of Cupertino, the densest part of this part of the valley. We don't want to leave. And it's not just the weather, it's the environment. It's the ecology of Silicon Valley that really has never been duplicated elsewhere. And why not? Because of this early history. The things I just talked to you about. The valley was much more casual. It was different from any place else. The government wasn't interfering. It wasn't watching. It was very laissez-faire. And the people who built this valley were the sons and daughters of blue-collar workers. Gordon Moore's dad was the sheriff in Half Moon Bay. Bob Noyce's dad was an itinerant preacher in Iowa. Charlie Spork's dad was a shop steward. Jerry Sanders' dad, he never even knew his dad. These guys came from Midwestern, hardworking, ethical stock. And the valley still has that in its bones. It's lost a lot of it in recent years because the people who lead the valley now tend to be the children of professionals, academics, people with a considerable amount of, already have a considerable amount of wealth and degrees, etc. It's a different crowd that's running the valley. And I wrote a piece in LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago, an essay, where I really suggested that the fact the founders came from such, basic stock kept them centered. And as rich as they got, and as powerful as they got, they still had an empathy for the working person. Today, I sense in the valley, a lot of that's been lost. I'm not sure how much empathy there is for people that are not doing as well as the senior executives of some of these giant companies. And that's not a good thing, because that increasing detachment from everyday life leads companies now to not have a problem with censoring people that are posting on Facebook or Twitter, deciding what's right for people, allowing people's privacy to be interfered with because you don't think they're living their lives properly. That's a sea change, and I don't think it's a good one. I mean, I'm a 4th generation newspaper man, and I came from a world in which you comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And we've moved to a world where we worship the very, very successful and sort of leave the average folks behind, as if the electronics revolution was not for them. They don't get to participate fully except to buy our products. That's a worrying trend. But I think it can also be overcome. Now, the question is, will there be other Silicon Valleys out there? You know, I haven't seen one yet. I keep waiting for one. I've been to Austin, I've been to Seattle, I've been to Portland, I've been in the Flatiron District of New York. Yeah, they all have technology companies, but they don't have this entire ecology that we have here. And they've never quite produced it. They've done portions of it, but literally there's nothing like this. And I'm constantly amazed, and it keeps us going. I declared Silicon Valley dead and over about 4 times over the last 20 years. And I finally gave up because the Valley has an ability to revive itself, to come back Phoenix-like. I mean, 1974, every other dad in my neighborhood was laid off. Same thing happened 10 years later. And then we saw what happened in 2008. The Valley literally stopped dead for about 3 weeks. And I suspect we're heading into another one again. We have chip shortages. If anything happens in Taiwan, we won't be able to build, we're already not building F-150 Ford trucks because they can't get the chip. But what happens when we can't build Apple computers or iPhones? That's a serious danger. And we're in a period right now where it may take 5 years to get chip production back up to build all the new wafer fabs to build the chips we're going to need. So things could slow down terribly around here. Will it be the death of the Valley? Well, it wasn't in 2000. At one point there were more, you could not get a rental truck, a U-Haul truck in Silicon Valley because they were all gone with everybody leaving. So the Valley has a unique ability to come back. So I'm not going to write it off. There's a distinct possibility the Valley's greatest days are ahead. Let me talk about the future now, because we got 11 minutes. I didn't talk too much. Any questions, by the way? Oh, okay. I'll keep going.
Later, Mike. Later, we'll get.
Okay,
there.
save it for later. Okay, the center of gravity of Silicon Valley is about a mile from my house. It's at the intersection of 101, 280, and 237. Just kind of that little triangle right there, because you're going to find nearby there Google. Well, if you go 5 miles any direction from my house in Sunnyvale, the Apple mothership, Intel, Google, Facebook, Tesla, LinkedIn has taken over downtown Sunnyvale. This is the center, but my sense is the center of the Valley, the heart, is going to move south now in the next 2 or 3 years to downtown San Jose. And why? Well, partly because it's a transportation node, and outlying cities are talking about high-speed rail to get over this traffic problem. But more importantly, Google's new headquarters is coming up. And even before they really break ground on this, there are so many other companies that are moving down there, and residential construction is insane. It seems like every crane in Northern California is in downtown San Jose right now. And if you price homes, even in old 1920s districts like Burbank, the prices are racing towards Silicon Valley level. And when Google gets in there and puts a 50 or 75,000 people in downtown San Jose, the demand on the infrastructure, you're going to see a lot more restaurants and shops and everything else. There's going to be a renaissance in downtown San Jose. And I sense that's where it's going to go. Meanwhile, people right now are leaving the Valley, and they're leaving for several reasons. One of them is cost of living. Another one is COVID. it was cool to be able to, live in your San Francisco apartment, 25 years old, live in your San Francisco apartment, get up, get on the dawn bus, head down to Silicon Valley, and be out in the world all day, then come home at 11 o'clock at night and just go to sleep in your apartment. It's a little different when you're basically locked in your house your apartment for 18 months, and then you start looking around going, why am I paying $5,000 a month to essentially be a prisoner in a minimum security prison? Why don't I just go home to Iowa? I can work from there. They're letting me go home. And so thousands of people from the Valley and even more, I think, from San Francisco have gone home, or they've gone to some place, like Oregon or something that has a nice environment. You can be in the woods, you can be at the beach and still do your job because your company is allowing you to be out there and do your job. And you've discovered some surprising things, which is you can do your job, from Albuquerque, even if you work for Intel in Santa Clara. Moreover, the companies have discovered you didn't lose your productivity. You actually may be more productive out there than you are trying to fight the traffic to get to the Apple headquarters in Cupertino and sit in an office all day. Because you're controlling your time, you're happier in your environment, and you're not wasting hours traveling and dealing with all the problems of the Valley. So the Valley has lost some people. And also a lot of older Valley people are checking out. They're cashing out. If you got a house for 17 grand, it's worth $3 million. Why aren't you in Ashland watching Shakespeare plays, instead of trying to get to, Zanotto's to pay, too much for meat? I mean, and that's a decision being made by a lot of people right now. Now, certain things still remain. Well, by the way, I should mention San Jose's relationship to San Francisco since 1850 was the country cousin, the hick to the sophisticated city. But in the 1960s and 70s, that reverted. San Francisco became the bank for all the cool companies in Silicon Valley. My sense is it's about to change again, that San Francisco will always be one of the great cities of the world, but its role is not going to be dominant in the economy. San Jose is going to be. And I think that's going to be an interesting turn we're going to see in the next few years. Okay, certain things remain in the Valley. Good weather. We better build some more dams or we're gonna run out of water pretty soon. But how can you beat Bay Area weather? Okay, I literally grew up with guys that would surf in the morning and ski in the afternoon. They have to drive 250 miles, but they could do it. But when 2 years ago I rode the Pony Express Trail down from Echo Summit to Sacramento, restoring the trail, it's gone. It got burned up last week, along with the towns we went through. So, if we don't manage our natural resources here, that could be a deal breaker. But right now, we still have that spectacular Valley weather, Bay Area weather. We also have venture capital. This is the home of most of the world's venture capital. And it looks like it's going to remain here. It does, especially now with Zoom calls, companies are making their pitches. I mean, Steve and I went to like 20 VCs sitting in their office, looking at these guys, looking at their watch as we're making presentations and all that. Nowadays, new startups make their pitches on Zoom calls, and you can even pretend they're actually listening on the other end because they're just, little tiny pictures and you don't see them look at their watch because it's below the camera level. So VCs have discovered that pitching, new startups pitching them actually can be done on Zoom calls, and they can do their due diligence by themselves, et cetera. So VCs love being here and they're going to stay here. You're still going to have to go hat in hand to Sand Hill Road, even if your companies move to Tempe or Nairobi, for all I know. I mean, that's where the future lies. That's going to keep the Valley the way it is. And finally, well, next to last, the entrepreneurial culture. Everybody here, the old joke is everybody in Silicon Valley is either going to work for or against or beside every other person in Silicon Valley before you retire. We have an entrepreneurial culture. Every one of your neighbors works in technology in one way or another, if not in the companies themselves, that in all the support operations, from people that mow the lawn and water the company plants to hired out HR people getting staffing on demand, to people that build the buildings, and lawyers and investors. So the valley's infrastructure is so complex and developed and mature and complete. It's going to be almost impossible to find it anywhere else in the next 25 years. So that's a centripetal force keeping people here. And then finally, this is interesting. The rise of new technologies and a new type of business organization is probably going to keep the valley going the way it is too. The new inventions are autonomous vehicles, smart drones, AI, robotics, and let's see, a few other ones. Yeah, well, those are the big ones. If we have autonomous vehicles, then traffic stops being much of a problem. If we have really, if Zoom goes to generation 12, the need to go to the office is going to be diminished greatly. If we have, they're experimenting with drones delivering your morning coffee and sandwiches and muffins in one town outside of Melbourne, Australia. Amazon's doing that. So, it used to be you had to go to a coffee shop to get a cup of coffee or make one of your own. And then you went to Pete's or Starbucks and a barista made it for you pretty quickly. But now the barista can make it for you and you just open your front door and there's a drone and you take it off the drone. I mean, apparently it's working to the point that a school in, I think, Maryland or Northern Virginia was delivering textbooks to students during COVID using drones. So a lot of things have to be worked out. There's also talk, there are companies getting money right now to make flying cars and flying taxis and flying taxis to get you from your house to the airport where you get on the plane. And the plane may be, they're talking about bringing back the new Concorde, the SSTs. So you're now going faster than the speed of sound. All of these things make it, interestingly, it makes it easier to not work where you are. You don't have to work at an office. You don't have to show up very often. But at the same time, it makes the places that have that structure places where companies want to be for their headquarters. And that too is being driven by Salim Ismail, who used to run the Singularity University out at Moffett Field. He runs an organization called Exponential Organization, EXO Works. And he wrote the best-selling book, I think, in Silicon Valley history a few years ago called The Exponential Organization. And his model of that is that traditional companies, the world is speeding up so fast, traditional companies can't survive. They just won't be able to move at that pace. And that to move at 10x, and he says that's the pace we're going to have to go 10 times faster than we are right now. Companies are going to have to depend upon things like staffing on demand. They're going to have to use their communities to help them design and deliver and service products. They're going to have to use crowds to help market their products and get people to think about them and use them. Companies are going to get smaller and smaller and bigger in their footprint. And that, I wrote a book called the what do I call it? The Protean Organization a few years ago. They gave it a different title. Publishers don't know what they're talking about. It's called the Autonomous Corporation. It was the notion that everybody increasingly is moving towards a gig economy. 80% of all new jobs in the United States in the last 5 years were gig jobs, not corporate jobs, not even small business jobs, but part-time, freelance gig jobs. And what that means is companies are going to look like quantum atoms. They're going to look like small nuclei of just a handful of people who carry the corporate culture, run the machines, do the planning, surrounded by a cloud of thousands and thousands of part-time people, either voluntary or paid. And some of those people are going to be part-time for 20 years. Some of them are going to do their job in 20 minutes. You know, in theory, I could be hired by, Mike could hire me for a minute and a half just to write the opening lead sentence of a press release. I mean, that's where the future lies. And that's going to, pardon me?
Wow.
That's,
Wow.
yeah, that's the future. And we're going to have to become our own entrepreneurs. I mean, the whole world's going to become like us. Entrepreneurial, managing our life, marketing and selling ourselves, and developing our expertise to be bought as contractors. And new structures are going to rise, like healthcare, life insurance, all those things designed for individuals, not corporate accounts. And this also suggests that the Valley's future, it could blow itself up with this, with all of its problems. It could become so overcrowded, nobody wants to be here and everybody leaves. Or it could become the home of even more companies, but much, much smaller with a global reach. And my sense is that's going to happen. Now, the state of California, working with unions in its wisdom, has decided that gig work is exploitation. If the state maintains that, that could be a threat to Silicon Valley, because the gig economy is the inevitable future. You know, it's like Canute trying to hold back the waves. It ain't going to happen. If you can't do gig work here, you're going to go somewhere else. Now, that's another reason why the Valley might survive, because what if Google had 500 employees in Mountain View or down in San Jose, and all the rest of their workers were gig workers spread out all over the world and on every continent? If it had the tools and the technology and had the AI to manage all of that, Google could stay here forever. The freeways would be a whole lot less crowded, and housing prices would stabilize. Now, if you're 20 years old going to, I don't know, New York University in engineering, and you want to go work for Apple, you might not go to Silicon Valley anymore. That might be just the reserve of lifers, you know, people carrying the torch of the company. There has to be a there. That's why I wrote The Autonomous Revolution, because I wrote The Virtual Corporation with Bill Davidow in the late 1980s. And I came to the realization that if companies went completely virtual, there would be no company there. There would be nothing that says, this is, you know, this is Apple Computer. This is our history. This is where we're going. And the final factor in Salim's vision of the exponential organization is the massive transformational purpose. And that is, companies have to think bigger than they've ever thought before. This is who we are. We're not building widgets. We are feeding the hungry in the world. We are extending human lifespans. We are improving global literacy. That's what we really are. These various products are just milestones along the way, are moonshots to get there. And that too lends itself to Silicon Valley, because where in the world do people think as big as we do, who have such outlandish dreams and then make them real? And as long as we have that, I think the Valley will be an even better place in the years to come.
Yeah.
And I went 50 minutes.
Mike, you are amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Everybody unmute and clap.
Terrific.
Wow. I've been here since 65. I've seen some of it, but you have described what's coming, and it's very exciting and it's terrifying.
As long as governments and other forces don't get in the way, we should be in good shape.
Well, that's to my point. I'm wondering the only question I can come up with, Mike, that everybody else would ask as well, is how do we control the misinformation that comes out of the companies in the Valley, the Twitters, the Facebooks, whatever. I'm sure you have a very succinct answer to that. And then while you're saying that, I would invite everybody else to please ask Mike a question.
Okay. I think one of the biggest problems facing the Valley right now is success. No, I'm not talking about the whole failure thing, like Valley's built on failure. That's basically Elizabeth Holmes's case this week. Yeah, the Valley's built on failure and I failed. So what's the problem? No, but I think we now have in this Valley the largest companies in the history of the world, the wealthiest companies in the history of the world, including Mr. Fox's company. He's number one, actually. Is that good for the Valley? I'm not sure it is. I'm not sure it's even good for those companies. What we've seen in history is if you have large companies and a handful of individuals who are essentially oligarchs running them, it dampens innovation, radical innovation. The big companies can afford a lot of innovation, but they tend to be incremental. Nobody's doing the crazy stuff you make up at Heats, on a Saturday morning. That's what small companies do. And the big companies, they sort of flatten entrepreneurship because they suck up talent. Now, history has shown that if you start breaking up some of these giant companies, everybody actually does better because it frees a lot of really talented people to go out and start their own companies, competing with these pieces, and oftentimes drives innovation even further. But people who are once part of this giant company, they go off into even more dynamic companies and they keep their wealth. So, everybody kind of makes out well. Nobody working for a giant company wants to see it break up, but it could actually, I'm trying to look at Mike's face, see if he's frowning, but it can actually be a salutary thing over time. And I worry if the Valley gets too many giant companies, it sort of crushes everything else. They're like dinosaurs. They're not dinosaurs. They're like giants with huge footprints and everything they do that they're moving. They whipsaw these tiny little city governments, run by, people that don't work in the Valley or housewives. They're getting whipsawed by these giant companies because what are they going to do? What are they going to say no? So we need a little more balance in all of that.
Next, anybody, who else?
Well,
Yeah.
I wanted to just ask a question in response to that, Mike.
I've finally seen your house.
Yes, I know you. Yes, the dining room. Yes. So, you talk about the big companies and about breaking up. A corollary to that is unfettered success. So I joined Apple in 2000, right? And we immediately went down the tubes, .com bust, and it's been horrible. So I've seen losing quarters.
Right.
Very few of our 25,000 employees in Silicon Valley have ever seen a losing quarter, right? And that's going over, right, 17, 18 years. That's true with Facebook. That's true with Google. So the three biggest. And that's true with a lot of smaller companies too. So could you talk about, if you look back, Intel, HP, AMD, all the more traditional companies that have been here, they had a couple up years, couple down years, couple up years, and we're in this unique time where the biggest companies have not had those cycles.
Yeah, kind of a hiatus from history. It's been very interesting because from about 1960 on, the Valley was characterized by a 4-year boom bust cycle. And there was nothing you could do about it. And it all would start with chips. And what would happen is the chip companies couldn't keep up with the economy and the demand. And they would try to ramp up production, but they couldn't do it fast enough. So all the clients out there in aerospace and manufacturing and all that would get desperate because their assembly lines would be frozen, kind of like the F-150 is right now. And they would go out to the gray market. They'd send their buyers out and say, I don't care what it takes, buy chips. And that created a whole criminal underground in the Valley where people were actually, the Black Gorilla family, I did a whole investigative story of this. The Black Gorilla family came down from Oakland and they were stealing chips off the loading dock at Intel, and gangs were bursting into Monolithic Memories with guns to steal chips to sell to companies. And that was the gray market. But that really characterized the desperation. And then because they couldn't meet demand, the Valley would go into a trough, then it would come back up. And this was a 4-year cycle. And it went on forever. And companies began, they would actually build into their business model that every 4 years we got to lay off a bunch of people. Well, and that was, we all got to the point where we believed that was inevitable. It was in the DNA of electronics that you have a 4-year boom bust cycle. Well, around about 2005, I mean, we did have the slowdown in 2008, but that wasn't our fault. That was the housing industry. We haven't had a downturn, like you said, in 15 years. There has not been a bust. It's just been one long continuous boom at various rates. I mean, sometimes it's a slow boom, sometimes it's an insanely fast boom, but there hasn't been a crash. And most people in this town they've never worked, as you said, in a company that's ever really had a downturn. And my sense is we have one coming right now because chip companies can't deliver. Manufacturing lines all over the world. I think Toyota just announced they can't deliver cars. Ford is delivering pickup trucks. The best-selling vehicle in America is the F-150 pickup truck. You can't buy one. Ford is sending them off to dealers without the computer chip that runs the engine. So everything's starting to freeze up, and it's not going to get a lot better. I guarantee you those companies are sending their buyers out everywhere in the world to find that missing chip. And pretty soon they're going to be talking to some bad guys, and those bad guys are going to be doing bad things. And we're going to have a whole black market here in the Valley for a few years. So that's my prediction. Look for that one.
I have a question. Mike, can you comment on the Elizabeth Holmes trial?
Sure. Actually, by the way, my podcast is not the Silicon Valley Insider. There's actually one called that. So we call ours the Silicon Insider. You can find it on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and everything else. I was just recording it this morning with Scott Budman from NBC Bay Area, and he's covering the trial at the courthouse. And there's some things you need to know. First of all, the situation, the environment is insane. Is turning into the Michael Jackson trial,
Yeah,
or the OJ trial.
Yeah.
Crowds, it's like Day of the Locust, Hollywood in the 30s. You got hundreds of people now showing up, and now the trial begins tomorrow. There's might be thousands of people showing up. We're going to see the Free Elizabeth signs pretty soon. Scott said there were 3 women dressed up as Elizabeth Holmes in the crowd with bleach blonde hair and black turtlenecks, and it's just insane. And she showed up. You always think of her as kind of a Steve Jobs clone, all black, the severe hair and all that.
That's what she wanted you to think. Yeah.
Yeah, she's showing up in printed dresses with curls, waves coming down. Nobody's heard her speak yet. She didn't even speak, put in whether she was guilty or not guilty, because the rumor is she has a different voice now than she had when she was running the company. So the question is she guilty or not guilty? Well, the other thing you need to know is she had a unique ability to talk to older venture capitalists.
Yep.
Older male venture capitalists.
Yep.
And they, who's saying yep?
I am.
All of us.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They all fell for it.
The whole board. The
well,
whole board fell for it.
I have to say that's not true. And the VCs did not fall for it. It was the politicians who
There you
fell
go.
for it.
Yes.
Oh, they
that's
did
right.
too. Yeah, but somebody gave her $200 million, and it wasn't politicians. It was the
Right.
VCs. And part of it was the way she looks, young woman, but it's also the way she presented herself. She slotted herself in perfectly as what the Valley wanted. They wanted a young, good-looking female CEO of the hottest new startup around. And the fact that she talked like a Valley person, looked like Jobs in his prime. She fit the whole matrix. And so, Steve will tell you, all these years talking to these guys, making presentations, well, we need to do our due diligence. And I always had this vision of due diligence. These guys have armies of researchers looking into every corner of the business plan and our backgrounds and our resumes and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm not sure they did a whole lot of due diligence, on Elizabeth Holmes and her company. I really don't, because it all sounded good, but there were red flags. Now, so I'm going to give you for her and against her. Not guilty, guilty. Okay, not guilty. The Valley is built on being a believer. You start a company because you believe with all of your heart that you have something important and you're going to build a great company around it. And you give up 100 hours a week, you give up your private life, you give up everything, maybe for a few years to make this thing succeed. And it succeeds sometimes only on a wing and a prayer, on your belief that it's going to work. And when it starts failing, you double down because it's you, it's an extension of you. And you're not going to give up until they carry you out the front door and put up, a for sale sign on the door for rent. Okay, that's the argument for Elizabeth Holmes. She can say, I believe in Theranos, I believe in the technology. I knew we could do it if we just had a little more time, a little more money. And we would have pulled it off and we'd have changed the world. Can you imagine like a diabetes test had 1 drop of blood and you can do your entire blood work on a chip? I mean, it's a dream. We all dream of that. Okay, so that's, and plus this partner boyfriend who supposedly abused her. So it rattled
All of a sudden, yeah.
It rattled her mind and all that. By the way, he's showing up down there too at the federal courthouse. And he has a knot of reporters around him, and he is countering her claims in real time. So this is a real media circus. And Scott says they weren't even allowed in the trial room. They had to go upstairs to its closed circuit TV, all these reporters from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and him for NBC. And he says it's just bizarre. Okay, now, why she's guilty? Because we have precedent for this. We have precedent for entrepreneurs going to the very end, the bitter end, the last mile, trying to save their companies, their babies, and they're willing to do anything. And they have that moment where they look into their soul and say, what does it mean to say, I'll do anything to make this work? And a few of them over the history of this town have said, I'm willing to break the law. I'm willing to embezzle money. I'm willing to, talk to the Russians in case they want some of our prototypes. I mean, this has happened before. So the argument that the defense is making, which is she really believed it, she thought it would work, it failed, but Silicon Valley is built on failure. And I feel kind of guilty because I've been writing for 25 years. The Valley is not really about success. It's about successful failure. Now I regret it because, it's now being used to damage the image of the Valley. But I think my gut, I honestly don't know. I mean, my impression is just from, I'm not down there. I'm not in the middle of that Day of the Locust stuff or watching her. But my impression is she's a very good actress.
Oh.
And you'd have to be kind of, is she a con woman? Well, I notice a lot of women think she is. Women are usually better at reading women, obviously better than men are. Is she a sociopath? Sociopaths do well in this town. There's no shortage of them. Not too many con men. They usually get driven off. She seems to almost come out of nowhere, builds this giant company, has the temerity to put it on the top of Page Mill above Hewlett Packard headquarters. That as a reporter, the red flag went up for me right then. Because one of my rules as a reporter is when you go into a startup, I went into eBay like its second week. They had a card table and a case of Jolt Cola. I was at Apple on Bub Road when it was, I don't know, 6 months old. I was like the first reporter in there. It was just a concrete tilt up, 3 or 4 offices. Woz was in one. It was completely jammed to the ceiling with parts. And Steve was in the other one, and he had books and all sorts of stuff in that one. That was basically Apple Computer. I was at Siebel Systems. You know, it sold to Oracle for, I think, $8 billion. Tom Siebel was in a $1,000 suit. Pat House was in a $1,000 woman's business suit, but they were working at, they paid for the suits. They were working at military surplus desks, you know, and they had a jar of Red Whips, and that was Siebel Systems. As a reporter, if I go in and I see mahogany paneling, you know, and expensive chairs, the red light goes, the alarm goes off, and I say, they're not going to make it. Well, I looked at Theranos sitting up there, and it was like, how come I'm hearing this is the greatest thing in the world, but everything says this is a fraud. This is never going to make it. So do I think she's guilty or not guilty? I'm going to leave it to the jury. It's not self-evident to me which it is right now. Let's hear the testimony. And it's going to be interesting because apparently the witness list is amazing. They're actually going to call Henry Kissinger. Do you know how old Henry Kissinger is? 98. They're going to put a 98-year-old man on the stand on this. And you know, one of my first thoughts was, well, no harm, no foul. They didn't hurt anybody except people that put in money. But then I began to realize they actually had some product out there, and people were being told they had cancer. And then, you know, there was a young woman with a family, and she was told she had some fatal disease. She got tested 4 different times, and they finally said, those tests didn't show anything. You're fine. You know, I feel the same way about hackers. You shut down an electrical grid and you shut down a hospital and somebody dies on the operating table, that hacker's a murderer, you know, and you try him as a murderer. You don't hire him as a consultant to fight future hackers. I feel the same way that if you actually did damage to people's physical lives, you're on the hook for it.
Well,
So how's that? I don't know if I gave the answer. I gave a
Awesome.
no, that was awesome.
Right. Amazing. Wow. Next, who has another stellar? Thank you, Deborah. Come on, ladies. Come on, ladies. One more.
Yeah, one more. We're burning up time.
Oh, gosh. Oh, gosh.
By the
Mike,
way, let me throw something. If Mike's still here.
Well,
I wanna say-
I've got a question for you, Mike, since,
Okay, but I have something for you too.
oh, all right. Well, let me ask mine first. So, and I'm very biased. I'm a, the fourth generation Cal Bear, but we know how important Stanford is in the history of the Valley. Steve was very close to Stanford, as you know. He had his funeral there and gave a lot of money to the medical school there. Personally, as well as Apple has a huge partnership with Stanford. And so Stanford clearly, and you talked about it, played a huge role. I'm curious from your perspective about Cal and what role it did play or didn't play in the Valley and why.
Yeah.
You know, I've always believed, let me say my thing first, real quick, so you'll feel good. Of all the companies, the giant companies in the Valley, the one that least deserves antitrust or anything else is Apple. Because Apple has been defending its users' privacy and their free speech, almost alone among all the great companies in the Valley. And it never strikes me, Apple's a serious competitor, but it's not predatory. And it's not choosing to use tricks of the trade to impact the brains of our children.
Right.
And for that reason, I would actually give, even though it's the biggest of all, I would actually give Apple a buy on this.
Wait, is this a Mike thing?
Well, I can tell you, just as an aside on that, we bought an advertising company years ago, and then they saw how little data we have on anyone, and they basically said, we can never make any money. Like, nobody's going to buy your ads, Apple, because you don't know anything about any of your customers. And we're like, yeah, well, we know if their devices are working, but we don't know anything about their personal lives.
Yes, and the fact that Cook has done that says wonders about him. which is interesting because what was Tim Cook's dad's job?
I don't
I
know.
think he was a kind of a longshoreman down
I
in the
guess he was a
South.
union guy, yeah.
A union guy, yeah. He's got the blood. He's got the roots. You know, how about Mark Zuckerberg? What were his parents? College professor? Yeah. What about just go along the list. They're all 2%ers. They're parents. They've never gone hungry. They've never been broke. I can guarantee Tim Cook grew up in a house where money was tight a lot of times. He understands. So kudos to him. Okay, Cal. Everyone gives Stanford all the credit, but one of the reasons the Bay Area is so special is we have such a complex network of educational institutions, and they all dovetail each other, and they all feed different levels of every corporation in town. So at the top, you have Cal and you have Stanford. I'll put Cal first this time because, in terms of management and leadership, my impression is Cal's business school actually produces better real leaders than Stanford's does, because Stanford's guys are all empiricists.
Yeah.
Cal guys are leaders. Okay, so that's at the top. And you can put up there University of San Francisco Medical School, those kinds of things. But those are the two biggies. Then right below that, you have the second, and they provide the executive row of the Valley. Second tier are my alma mater, where I teach, Santa Clara, St. Mary's, the rest of USF, schools like that. They provide
University of San Francisco.
like division general managers, lower level vice presidents. The next tier down are the state schools, San Jose State. I put up there with Santa Clara also in St. Mary's, the Catholic schools. I put UC Santa Cruz, that sort of thing. Then we have San Jose State and San Francisco State and the state colleges, Hayward. They provide the next tier down, which are department managers, that sort of thing. And then we have the community colleges, and they're providing supervisors. This is kind of I'm being very rough on this because some very top leaders in Silicon Valley went to San Jose State, and there was a senior vice president of HP when I was there who was a Santa Clara grad. But in terms of the general target, we have the community colleges, Foothill, we have a wealth of community colleges. I mean, there's like 16 around the Bay. I mean, this is the greatest education available. I mean, you can, especially if you go 2 years to a community college and then you jump to UC Davis or something like that for the last 2 on your bachelor's. Cheapest deal in America. Okay, and then below that, we have a multiplicity of trade schools, from Condé College to, training schools for people to work on fab lines, that sort of thing. And that provides the mass of people working in the Valley. So we are providing trained, smart people who live in a technology milieu with the skills they need to enter wherever they're capable in the Valley. And you might be able to find that in Boston, but Boston has such a fatalistic outlook on life. It's sort of like, yeah, we were big in mini computers, but they went away, but so did the mills. Things come, things go. In Silicon Valley, you fight to the death. So Boston has it, New York has it, but maybe Chicago, but not that much, not tech. So this is the one place in America where we have this beautiful ecosystem of education. And Cal is at the top with Stanford. I'm not gonna ignore its presence. It's a very important presence. Was that a good answer, Mike?
I like it,
When I go the big game, I don't know which side to sit on. I just sort of sit in the middle and cheer both.
Well, it's 6:15. We've overstayed our welcome by 15 minutes, and thank you, everyone.
Oh,
Mike, thank you for an inspiring historical, futuristic presentation. We, back on my side, were just oohing and ahhing the whole time. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. It was fun. It's always nice to do stuff with you guys. I'll keep doing it for years to come. If you
Well,
invite
please
me.
come back.
Okay.
Love it. We will love it. We will love it. I have one more thing to put into this conversation, and that is that on October 14, we are going to have Dr. Elizabeth Hadley from Stanford, and she is the faculty advisor of Stanford Jasper Ridge, and she's going to be talking about species extinction. If you saw the David Attenborough recent documentary on species extinction, she was the heroine on her commentary of what's going on. She is a wonderful lady. I know her. Linda and I had a fabulous luncheon with her, so we're looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So we'll see you on October 14th. And again, Mike, thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Mike.
You are
Thanks,
a
Linda, thank you for making this possible.
Well, thanks for being such a great audience. And Linda, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Excellent program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, see you later.
Thank you.
I usually wait. and see.
Yeah.
Guess everybody's muted, so I can go. Okay. Well, anyway, it
That
was
was really good.
awesome.
Yeah.
And meeting.